There was a place set for Belen Ostry at the Harrow table on the first night, and she understood, much later, that the whole war she was losing had been lost in that one small courtesy before she had unpacked her case. She had come to Winnow to fold it. That was the word, and she used it, in her own head, without flinching, because Belen Ostry was a professional and folding towns was her profession, and there was no shame in a clean fold done well. She was not a soldier. She had never fired a weapon or ordered one fired. She was an administrator of absorption, one of the quiet Velthani functionaries the Accord sent to worlds it had decided to bring into the order, and her craft was the fold without a shot, the ration adjusted, the council co-opted, the curfew set, the pressure applied to a town's institutions and its pride and its will until the town, as one, wearied and gave way and accepted the good order of the galaxy. It was the civilized way. It was the thing the Accord was proudest of, that it could take a world without breaking it, and Belen Ostry was good at it, and had folded a dozen towns, and had never once had to be cruel, because a well-run fold is not cruel, it is only patient. Winnow was to be her 13th. A grey farming town on a grey colony world, unremarkable, unfortified, a place of ordinary people who dug a little ore and grew a little grain and had received, as such places did, the notice that meant the Accord had decided to have them. There was no garrison to reduce. There was only the town, and its will, and Belen Ostry, sent to fold the one by finding and breaking the other, billeted, because that was the method. You lived inside the thing you were folding, you learned it from its own table, with a family called Harrow, in a spare room, in a grey house on a grey street, in the ordinary heart of the thing she had come to end. Eli Harrow met her at the door. A widower, the files said, 2 children, keeper of no particular importance, a man who worked the ore and raised his young alone. He was not warm and he was not cold. He took her case, and showed her the room, and when the meal was ready he did the thing that Belen Ostry had not expected and could not, for the life of her, later stop thinking about. He set a place for her at the table. Not grandly. Not as a gesture. Simply, the way you set a place for anyone under your roof, because that was how his house worked, and it had not occurred to him to run his house any other way just because the Accord had sent someone to fold his town from the spare room. "You'll eat with us," he said. It was not a question, and it was not a kindness exactly, and it was not surrender. It was just the table. The little ones ask questions. You don't have to answer them. Bram especially. He's 6 and he thinks everyone from the sky knows everything. He almost smiled, and did not quite. Sit where the plate is. And Belen Ostry, sent to break the will of Winnow, sat down where the plate was, in the warm grey kitchen of the family she had come to starve, and began, without either of them knowing it, to lose. This is the story of a town that could not be folded, told not from a battlefield but from a kitchen table, because that is where it was decided, one set place at a time. There is no siege in it and no fleet and no shot fired. There is only a quota, and a clock, and a decent woman with a ledger, discovering that the thing she has spent her life knowing how to break is a thing that this one town simply, quietly, unbreakably does not have. Belen Ostry began, as she always began, by finding the will of the town, so that she could break it. A town has a will. That was the first principle of her craft, taught before any other. A town is not a heap of people, it is a single thing, with a pride and a leadership and a breaking point, and you fold it by finding the point and applying the pressure. It was, properly understood, a mercy of a doctrine, because it meant a whole world never had to be handled person by person. You found the joint the town's weight all rested on, and pressed there, and the rest came down together, cleanly, the way a coat comes off with one pull once you have found the sleeve. Belen Ostry had spent her whole working life finding sleeves. She had never once, walking up a grey road with her case in one hand and her orders in the other, doubted that the town at the end of it would have won. So she went looking for Winnows the way she had gone looking in the dozen towns before this one. She sat in on the council and marked which voices the others deferred to. She read the ledgers and learned who held the town's small debts and who held its respect, because on some worlds those had always turned out to be the same person, and on Winnow, she noted with the first small itch of unease, they plainly were not. She found the leaders. There are always leaders, the ones a town leans on, whose breaking breaks the rest, and she began, patiently, professionally, without cruelty, to break them. She began with Aldous Pruitt, because Pruitt was the easiest kind of leader to find on any world and the easiest kind, on every world she had worked before this one, to Bend, a careful man who had taken the council chair the way a man takes over his father's mill, because someone in the family always had, and who had spent years now mistaking the sound of his own gavel for the sound of the town actually listening. She did not have to threaten him, not really, not the way soldiers threatened. Her craft did not run on soldiers. She found, in an afternoon of reading the depot ledgers, that Pruitt's mill was 2 seasons behind on a levy the council itself had voted before he ever chaired it, a debt nobody had troubled to collect because collecting it would have meant Pruitt collecting it from himself. She brought him the ledger, privately, in the small back room of the council house where he kept the town seat accounts, and she did not raise her voice, because raising your voice was a soldier's tool and she was not a soldier. She told him she could forget she had ever opened the ledger. She told him, in the same breath, exactly which directive she would need him to bring the council, and how soon. Pruitt signed. He signed the ration schedule she put in front of him, and the curfew order, and the requisition that let her clerks walk the grain stores with a counting rod, and he did it with the particular gray resignation of a man who has just understood that the last years of his authority were never real, that he had been borrowing the town's patience and calling it his own, and that the bill for the borrowing had come due, all at once, to a stranger who had found it in an afternoon. That was, on any of the dozen towns before this one, where the fold began, the town's chosen voice going over, quietly, and the towns will draining out of the place behind it, the way water goes out of a cracked jar, all in one direction, all at once, because everyone can see the crack and everyone after that drinks more carefully. Belen Ostry had watched it happen a dozen times. She watched for it now, in the week after Pruitt signed, the way you watch a held breath for the exhale. It did not come. She went to the grain depot the morning the new requisition took effect, in the ordinary quiet way she went everywhere, to watch the fold begin. A farmer named Costigan, she had his name from the ledgers, an unremarkable man with an unremarkable holding, stood at the counting window and read the new number twice, and then looked past the clerk to Pruitt, who was standing where council chairs stood on requisition mornings, to be seen standing there. Aldous, the farmer said, not unkindly, the way you would ask a man where he had put a borrowed tool, did you vote for this? And Pruitt, to his very small credit, did not lie. I signed it, he said. Costigan nodded, the way you nod at weather, and said, well. I expect she made it hard on you to do otherwise, and shouldered his sacks and went home to tell his own table what the number was and to work out, alone, in his own kitchen, what he meant to do about it, and it was that last part, Belen understood, watching him go, that undid the whole doctrine. Costigan did not go home believing Pruitt had betrayed him, and did not go home believing Pruitt had saved him. He went home holding a fact, the way you hold a bad weather report, and set about doing what a family does with bad weather, which is manage it, quietly, in private, without asking the rest of the street to feel it with him. She crossed Pruitt off that night. Not because he had failed her, he had done exactly as told, signed exactly what she needed, but because his signature, which should have been the sleeve the whole coat came off with, had turned out to fasten nothing at all. The town had never draped itself over Aldous Pruitt in the first place. It had only ever let him hold the gavel, the way you let a child hold the ceremonial half of a task so the child feels useful, while the actual work of being a town went on in 100 kitchens the gavel had never once reached. She kept a private ledger, as she always did, of the town's pressure points, the leaders, the institutions, the prides, the fears, and she began, that first week, to cross them off, one entry at a time, each one applied correctly and each one, in turn, failing to matter. The council chair was the first line in it. It would not be the last. She cut the rations next, because the ledger said rations were next, and because the doctrine held that hunger was the most reliable lever there was, not starvation, never starvation. That was crude, and Belen Ostry did not deal in the crude, but the calibrated smallness that makes a person choose the easy path over the proud one, meal by meal, until the choosing becomes a habit and the habit becomes surrender. She posted the new figures on the board outside the depot, the way regulation required, plain numbers anyone could read, so much grain ahead, so much meal, so much of the salted stores held back against the season's turn. It was not cruelty, she told herself, and the sentence came without her having to build it anymore. She had built it so many times on so many worlds. It was pressure, applied by the book, at the rate the book recommended, and the book had never yet been wrong about what pressure like that did to a town. She watched the board that first morning too, because that was the discipline. You watched your own lever land. She watched a line of Winnow's people read the new number, one at a time, the way people read a number that changes what their week will hold, and she watched for the thing the doctrine promised, the murmur that becomes a grumble that becomes a crowd, the crowd that becomes the town's grievance made visible, the visible grievance she could then, patiently, direct at whatever institution she chose to have it break against. She had built entire folds out of exactly that murmur. There was no murmur. There was a woman who read the number, said something short to the friend beside her, and went off to refigure her household's week on the spot, counting on her fingers what she would give up and what she would keep. There was an old man who read it, folded the notice once, put it in his coat, and walked home already composing, she was almost sure, the smaller version of the news he meant to give his wife. There was Eli Harrow, whom she recognized from 3 houses down the moment before she remembered whose roof she slept under, reading the same number she herself had signed into being, and doing nothing more dramatic than turning for home to start the arithmetic that would decide what his own children ate that week. That was the whole of it, over and over, a street's worth of people reading the same hard number and turning, one at a time, toward their own doors, to solve it alone. Nothing gathered. Nothing passed between them that she could see or measure, no shared heap building toward the crowd her doctrine required. Each of them simply picked the number up like a stone handed to them personally, and carried it home to their own hearth to work out what it would cost, and set it down there, in private, where it could not touch the stone in the next house at all. 2 doors down from the Harrows, she learned later, a widow named Sorrel Pike had less than anyone on the street, because her holding was smallest and the cut hit hardest, and no town meeting decided what happened next, no council resolution ordered it. 3 neighboring households, on their own, in the space of a week, without ever once discussing it as a street, simply began leaving a little more at Sorrel Pike's door than the ration required them to keep for themselves. It was not organized. It was not, so far as Belen could ever determine, even coordinated. Each family had simply noticed the same thing and done the same small private thing about it, the way 3 people standing near a fire each move a little closer without agreeing to. It should have been, by any reading of her doctrine, the beginning of exactly the shared resistance she was trained to find and break, a town rallying around its most vulnerable, a visible solidarity she could target. She went looking for the meeting where it had been decided. There was no meeting. There had only ever been 3 kitchens, each solving the same small problem in the same small way, entirely unaware that this made them, in her ledger, a pattern at all. She learned what her own cut had done to the house she lived in the way she learned everything now, at the table, without being told directly. The bread was thinner that week, and there was less of the salted fish, and Eli Harrow did not remark on it, did not look at her when he cut it thinner, only cut it and passed it around the way he always had, evenly, his own portion smallest of anyone's, which she noticed and said nothing about because there was nothing honest left to say. Bram asked, once, why there was not more, in the plain way children ask why the sky is a color, and Eli told him the truth in a size a 6-year-old could hold. There's less to go around this month, he said, so we go around it carefully. Bram accepted this the way he accepted most facts about the world, filed it, and went back to more interesting questions, and that was the whole of the conversation, and nothing about it gathered into anything Belen Ostry could point to and call the fold beginning. She crossed the ration off in the ledger that night, in the billeted room, the way she had crossed off Pruitt, and sat a while with the pen still in her hand, because she had begun to notice a shape to the crossing off that troubled her more than any single failure could. Each lever worked exactly as designed on the one person it touched, and stopped dead at that person's front step, as though every house on the street kept its own separate weather, and none of it ever crossed a threshold into the next. The curfew was the last of the 3 levers in the ledger's usual order, and she set it the way the book prescribed, full dark to first light, a patrol on the 2 roads in and out of the town proper, no papers required for anyone found in their own dooryard but papers required for anyone found past it, penalties graduated and mild at first and less mild if the mildness did not take. It was, of every lever, the one she disliked most privately, because it was the one that put a face on the fold, her patrol's face, walking Winnow's roads after dark with a lamp and a ledger of names, a small daily reminder to every house that the fold had a body it wore. Doctrine held that this was useful. A visible occupation, doctrine held, gathers resentment faster than an invisible one, and gathered resentment is the fastest fuel there is. It gathered nothing she could use. She rode the patrol herself the first week, as she always did on a new lever, to see it land, and what she saw was not resentment pooling into the shared thing she needed. She saw Eli Harrow, kept past dark at the ore works by a broken haul line the foreman would not release him from, stopped at the edge of town by her own patrol and made to stand while a clerk checked his papers against a list, in full view of anyone still awake to see it, the administrator's own household guest, held up at the paperwork end of her own occupation, and she saw him take it in the exact gray silence he took everything in, hand over the papers, wait out the checking, and walk the rest of the way home without a word to the patrol or, that night, to her, though she knew he knew whose order had put the patrol on that road at that hour. She saw Nessa, the second week, standing at the edge of the dooryard well past the hour a child ought to be standing anywhere, not sneaking, not hiding, simply standing in plain sight of the patrol lamp with her arms folded, daring the clerk to write her name down for being 10 years old and awake in her own yard looking at the stars, which the clerk, wisely, did not do, because there was no directive that covered a girl standing on her own family's ground refusing to be afraid of a light. Belen watched that from the kitchen window and felt something in her chest do the thing it had started doing at this table more often than she could any longer call professional distance. And she saw, across the whole of the town, in the weeks the curfew held, exactly the pattern the ration had already shown her and the council chair before that, obedience, universal and total and entirely private. Every house went dark when the hour said to. Every door stayed shut. Every name got checked and matched and let through or held, exactly as the ledger required, and not one household's obedience leaned on any others, so that there was never a night the whole town's patience broke at once, only a great many separate nights of a great many separate households doing what they were told and hating it alone, in rooms nobody else could hear. She asked Eli about it once, late, after the children were down, in the unguarded hour she had started allowing herself at his table when the day's business was finished. "Doesn't it gall you," she said, "being stopped on your own road?" "It galls me," he said, without heat, working his hands the way a tired man works his hands when he wants something to do with them and there is nothing left to do. Galls the whole street, I expect, each in their own house. But galling isn't a plan. It's just a feeling you carry to bed and get up with the next day and go to work anyway, because Bram still needs feeding whether or not I'm angry about the road I feed him from. He looked at her, not unkindly. You keep waiting for the gall to turn into something you can point at. It won't. It isn't that kind of thing. It's just weather in 100 houses. You'd know that by now if you'd ever lived in one instead of folding it. She crossed the curfew off the ledger the next morning. 3 levers, 3 clean applications, 3 total failures to gather into anything at all, and she sat with the ledger open on her knee in the billeted room and understood, with the specific cold of a woman running out of doctrine, that she had emptied the whole ordinary catalogue of a town's pressure points and had nothing left in it to press. The Harrow table was where all of it undid itself, and it did the undoing so slowly that Belen Ostry could not afterwards say on which particular night the profession stopped being the whole of her. It was not only Nessa's directness and not only Eli's plate. It was smaller than that, and steadier. It was the ordinary furniture of a house that had decided to keep being a house no matter who slept in its spare room. It was Bram's chair, which he refused to sit in any way but backward through the first weeks of her billeting, until one evening he simply sat in it forward, without ceremony, as though he had privately decided she was no longer someone worth performing for. It was the mended elbow of Nessa's second-best coat, stitched in a thread that did not quite match, because thread that matched cost more than the coat was worth on the ration Belen herself had signed. It was the particular quiet of a house doing its evening chores around a stranger it had stopped, in every practical sense, treating as a stranger, Eli banking the stove, Nessa clearing plates before anyone asked her to, Bram narrating his own day at a volume that assumed the whole table wanted to hear it, which, increasingly, it did. Supper in the Harrow house followed its own unhurried order, whatever the ledger said about what filled the plates. Eli set the table before the food was ready, from habit, and cutlery laid the same worn way every time, the handles all facing the same direction because his wife had done it that way once and he had never seen a reason to do it differently. The kitchen smelled of banked peat and the particular mineral sourness of a house near the ore works, a smell Belen had stopped noticing as strange somewhere in the second month, and under it, some nights, the smell of bread that had less butter than it once had and was toasted a little longer to make up the difference, a trick Eli had learned and never once mentioned. Bram said grace when it was his turn in the rotation, a garbled, sincere little speech that changed shape every night and always ended the same way, with thanks for the roof, and Nessa rolled her eyes at the same point every time, and Eli let her, because letting his daughter roll her eyes at supper was, Belen came to understand, its own kind of ordinary mercy, proof that whatever else the occupation had taken from this house, it had not taken the small permission to be exactly as tired and exact with each other as they had always been. The children asked her questions, and the questions themselves changed as the season wore on, the way a house's questions do once the stranger in the spare room has stopped, in practice, being a stranger. Bram, in the early weeks, asked her the vast impossible questions 6-year-olds ask of anyone new, whether she had seen the son of the Velthani homeworld, whether it was true her people lived 1,000 years, whether, if they lived 1,000 years, they got 1,000 birthdays, and what you could possibly want for the 1,000th. Later, once he had exhausted the size of her, his questions got smaller and stranger and harder to answer, the way a child's questions do once he stops asking about the shape of the world and starts asking about the shape of the person across the table, whether she had a Bram of her own, somewhere, being fed by someone else's roof. Whether the Accord would be angry with her for not folding them yet. Whether, when she did fold them, because he had absorbed enough of the grown talk by then to know that was meant to be the plan, she would still come to supper after, or whether folding meant she went away. She did not have a good answer to that last one, and told him so, and he accepted the not knowing the plain way children accept most adult admissions, filed it, and asked her, in the same breath, whether Vilthani dreamed, and whether dreaming hurt. He asked her, another night, whether it was true that Vilthani could count a whole town's worth of feeling as easily as counting apples, because Nessa had told him something of the kind, and he wanted to know how many apples Winnow was. Belen told him, carefully, that it was not really counting, whatever it looked like from outside, and that no, she could not tell him how many apples Winnow was, because she had come to believe, the longer she sat at this table, that Winnow was not a number of anything at all, it was every single supper in every single house happening at once, and nobody had ever built a way to count that, and she was no longer sure anybody should. Bran considered this with the grave attention he gave all her answers, and said that he thought that was probably a better thing to be than a number, and went back to his plate, and Belen sat a moment unable to eat, because a 6-year-old had just said, plainly, over a bowl of thin soup, the whole of what her ledger had spent a season failing to say. Nessa's questions had never had that soft outer layer to shed. She had gone straight to the hard center of things from the first night, and what changed in her, across the season, was not the bluntness but the aim, why the rations had been cut, what folding a town meant, whether Belen was going to make them leave, and she asked them plainly, across the table, watching Belen's face, because Nessa had understood from the first night exactly what the woman in the spare room was, and had decided she would not pretend otherwise even if the adults did. "You cut our rations," Nessa said to her, one evening, flatly, 10 years old and unafraid. "Ours. This family's. I saw the number on the board. And this still puts your plate down." "Nessa," Eli said. "It's all right," Belen said, because it was owed, and because she had stopped, some weeks before, being able to hide behind the method. "She's right to ask." "Yes. I cut the rations. Including yours. That is my work. I am here to fold this town, Nessa, which means to make it give up and accept the accord, and cutting the rations is one of the ways it is done." She looked at the girl, and then at the plate in front of her, the plate Eli set down every night. "I have folded a dozen towns this way. And I want to tell you a true thing, because you asked me a true thing. On every one of those dozen towns, by now, this far into the pressure, the town would have started to break. And Winnow has not. And I do not understand it. And I have been trying to understand it, and I think," she stopped, because she had reached, out loud, at a human table, the thing she had not let herself think in the billeted room with the ledger. "I think it is because of your father's plate. I think it is because there is no way to break this town, because the town is not a thing that can break. It is only houses. It is only tables. It is only a great many people each deciding, alone, in their own kitchen, to keep setting the place, and I have spent my whole life learning to break the will of towns, and it turns out Winnow does not have one, it has 10,000, and they do not break at the same time, and I cannot fold 10,000 wills one at a time. There is no method for it, there was never any method for it, because until your people no one ever had 10,000 separate wills instead of one." Eli Harrow looked at her across the table for a long moment. "We're not brave, if that's what you're working up to," he said, at last, and there was no pride in it, only tiredness. "Don't make us into something. I'm not holding this town. I couldn't hold a town. I'm just feeding my kids and setting the table the way my house sets the table, same as everyone on this street is just doing their own small thing in their own small house, and none of us could stop the rest of us doing it even if we wanted to, because it was never one thing we were doing." He passed her the bread, the cut ration, the less than there had been. "That's not courage. That's just how it is, being us. You keep looking for the one of us to break so the rest fall down. There's no one of us. There's just all of us, each on our own, and you can't get to all of us, one at a time, before we've raised another set of children who'll set another table. That's the whole trick, if you want to call it a trick. It isn't one. It's just that we were never the one thing you keep trying to break. There was a night, well past those early weeks, when Nessa found her alone in the kitchen after the others were down, mending the same coat elbow for the second time because the first mend had not held, and did not send Belen away, which by then was itself a kind of statement. You could requisition new thread, Nessa said, not looking up. Councils get requisitions. I could, Belen said. It would go in the ledger as a subsidy to a co-opted household. It would make Pruitt's signature look like it had done something after all. She sat across from the girl, in the place that had become, without either of them deciding it, simply her chair. I am not going to do that. Why not? Because it would be a kindness with my name attached to a fold. And I have started to want the kindness to just be a kindness. She had not said it aloud before, to anyone, and hearing it in her own voice in the quiet kitchen was its own small shock. I don't think I'm allowed that. But I want it anyway. Nessa looked up at that, properly, the look she gave adults when she had decided one of them had finally said something worth her attention. Des says you're not what they usually send, she said. He says the last folder they'd have sent wouldn't sit where the plate is. He says it like it's a bad sign for you, not a good one for us. She went back to the stitch. I think he's right, and I think it's worse than he means it. If you weren't, whatever you're becoming, at this table, they'd send someone who was, next. Someone who wouldn't mend a coat wrong twice and stay to watch. It was, Belen thought, the exact shape of the thing she had begun to feel in the billeted room at night with the ledger open on her knee, that her own decency was not a mercy to Winnow at all, only a delay, a softer hand on the same lever, and that the softness was the reason she had been trusted far enough into this kitchen to be undone by it. A crueler administrator would have kept the distance that kept the doctrine safe. She had not kept the distance. She had sat where the plate was, and let a 10-year-old say the true thing about it while mending a coat that was never going to fit right again no matter whose thread went into it. You're not wrong, she said, finally. I wish you were. I know, Nessa said, and bit the thread, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was, Belen understood later, the night she stopped being able to tell herself she was only doing her job at this table. The clock did not care that Winnow could not be folded. That was the thing about the clock, and about the ledger, and about the whole clean administrative apparatus Belen Ostry served. It had a place for a folded town and no place at all for a town that simply could not fold, and so it went on counting down toward a result it had no way of knowing was impossible. She had a quota. Every administrator did. A fold was expected by a date, in Winnow's case by the turn of the season, when the absorption schedule required the town status resolved so the next town down the list could be begun. The quota did not ask whether the fold was possible. It assumed it was, because in 100,000 years it always had been, because the whole science of absorption rested on the certainty that any town, pressed correctly, folds. The form Belen Ostry would have to file at the turn of the season had a field for it, a simple field, the field every folding report ended with, town folded, on this date, by these means. You wrote the date. You wrote the means. You filed it, and the town was absorbed, and you moved to the next. The pressure did not stay abstract for long. Some weeks before the turn of the season, a calm packet came up from the regional seat with Coordinator Vashti Wren's seal on it, brisk and courteous in the way superiors are courteous when they have not yet decided whether to be worried about you. 3 other administrators on the coordinators list had filed their folds already, the packet noted, 2 of them ahead of schedule. Winnow's file showed pressure applied correctly and on time and no result recorded, which the coordinator was certain was a filing oversight rather than a finding, because a fold correctly applied did not simply fail to register, it only, sometimes, took a season longer than the ledger liked. Would Administrator Austri confirm her projected fold date, so the schedule for the towns behind Winnow on the list could be set? Belen sat with the packet a long while before she answered it, because the honest answer was the one thing the form did not have a box for. She wrote, in the end, the sentence that was true and said nothing, pressure ongoing, all levers applied per doctrine, projected date to follow. It was not a lie. It was also not what the coordinator wanted, and she knew, sending it, that she had bought herself perhaps one more season of the regional seat's patience and no more, because an administrator who could not name a date was, in the quiet arithmetic of her profession, either incompetent or sitting on something worse than incompetence. She had, by then, almost nothing left in the ledger to cross off. The council, crossed off. The rations, crossed off. The curfew, crossed off. She had gone back, in the weeks after, and tried the lesser levers too, the ones doctrine listed as auxiliary rather than principal, the licensing of the depot scales, the assignment of labor details at the ore works, and each of those had failed exactly the way the first three had failed, individually, privately, absorbed by one household or one worker and never once passed on to the next. She tried the schoolmaster too, in one of those weeks, because doctrine listed the schooling as a minor lever with an outsized return. Trim the lessons, doctrine said, and the town's faith in its own future trims with them, and a town uncertain of its future is a town more willing to trade the future away for present ease. She did not enjoy this one. She told herself, walking to the schoolhouse, that she had done worse and would do worse again if the doctrine required it, and found, standing in the doorway of a single gray room with its rows of children bent over slates, that the sentence did not carry her the way it used to. Bram was 3 rows back at his own slate, not yet aware she was there. She gave the schoolmaster, a tired and careful woman named Osgood, the trimmed curriculum the coordinator's office required, fewer hours on the old records, fewer hours on anything that looked, to an auditor, like a town teaching itself to expect a future the accord had not authorized. And she watched, in the weeks after, for the thing doctrine promised, a town's children coming home confused and afraid, carrying that fear to their parents, the parents carrying it to each other, the whole town drawing together around the threat to what it was raising. Bram came home and told her, at supper, with some triumph, that they were doing less arithmetic and more just now sitting quietly, and he liked it. Nessa, further along in her schooling, said nothing at all at the table that night, but Belen saw her, later, reading an old lesson book of her own by lamplight after the others were down, quietly, on her own, replacing what the schoolhouse no longer gave her, and understood, watching her, that even this lever, the one built to reach a town through the one thing every household in it loved without reservation, had simply been absorbed. One child, one lamp, one private stubbornness at a time. And had never once gathered into the fear the doctrine required. She had, by the end of it, a full page of crossed-off entries and a blank space at the bottom where the next lever should have gone, and she sat, more than one night, with her pen over that blank space, unable to write a fourth thing to try, because there was no fourth thing. She had emptied the whole catalogue of a method built to break a will that this town had simply never had in the shape the method assumed. And underneath the professional despair, which she could at least name and file under the general heading of a difficult posting, there was a second thing she had far more trouble naming, because naming it meant admitting how far past the ledger her actual life at the Harrow table had gone. She had started, without deciding to, keeping a second and unofficial accounting alongside the first, not of levers and their failures, but of ordinary things she would miss the day the folding report finally forced her out of that spare room. Bram's narration of his day. The particular silence of Eli banking the stove. Nessa's stitches, uneven and stubborn. The weight of a full plate set down in front of her by a man who had every reason, in the doctrine's own ledger, to have stopped setting it, and had simply never stopped. She had folded a dozen towns and never once kept a second accounting like that, and she understood, turning the ledger's pages back and forth in the lamplight, that the second accounting was the real reason the first one had run dry. She had learned Winnow so thoroughly, exactly as her own method instructed her to, that she had learned it as people instead of as a target, and a method that requires you to know a thing that was never going to survive contact with a family that fed you. She knew which she would do. She had known, if she was honest, since the night of the plate. But she let the clock run down, and ate at the table, and put off the writing of it, because once she wrote it she would have to leave the Harrows, and she had discovered, to her own quiet horror, that she did not want to leave the Harrows, that the warm gray kitchen where she was failing to fold a town had become the first place in a dozen towns in a long career that had ever set a plate down for her, as if she were simply a person under the roof, and not the instrument of the order, and not the folder of the town, but only Belen, who sat where the plate was. The last weeks before the turn of the season were quiet ones, in the particular way a house goes quiet around a thing everyone in it has stopped pretending not to know. Eli did not ask her whether she had a date yet. Nessa stopped asking questions that were not innocent, not because she had run out of them but because, Belen understood, the girl had decided she already knew the answer and was only waiting, with a patience Belen had not expected in a child that age, for Belen to arrive at it herself. Even Bram's questions grew gentler, as if some current under the table's ordinary talk had reached him too, in the wordless way it reaches children, and told him that the woman across from him was somewhere in the middle of losing something and that the kind thing, this once, was not to ask what. There was one night, not long before the turn of the season, when she came down for water long after the house had gone quiet and found Eli still at the table, alone, in the dark, with no lamp lit, sitting the way a man sits when he does not want anyone to see his face doing what it is doing. She did not speak. She had learned, by then, when a person in that house wanted to be seen and when they wanted only to not be alone, and this was the second kind. She stood in the doorway a moment, in the dark with him, and then went back up without the water, and neither of them ever mentioned it, and it was, she thought afterward, the truest thing she ever learned about Eli Harrow, that the fear he never once let Bram or Nessa see was not absent, only private, carried the same way everything in this town was carried, alone, at its own table, in the dark, by the one person who had decided the children would not have to carry it too. She wrote it at the turn of the season, at the Harrow table, after the children were asleep, with Eli Harrow sitting across from her because she had asked him to, because she found she could not write the true thing alone. She did not file the folding report. She filed the other thing, the resignation, and she did not write it as a resignation, she wrote it as a confession, because that was what it was, and because she had spent a dozen towns and a career being one of the decent ones and she was not going to end by being decent about a lie. I cannot fold Winnow, she wrote, and I am not resigning because I have failed. I am resigning because I have succeeded. I have learned the town completely, from its own table, exactly as the method requires, and what I have learned is that the method is built on a thing that is not true. A town, we are taught, has a will, and folds when the will is broken. Winnow has no will. It has 10,000 wills, one to a household, and they do not break together, because there is nothing between them for a breaking to travel through. I have applied every lever in the ledger. Each one worked exactly as designed and produced nothing, because each lever is built to break a single town-wide will, and there is no single town-wide will here to break. I could fold a leader and the town did not lean on him. I could cut the rations and each household absorbed the hunger alone and passed none of it on. I could set a curfew and every house obeyed it, and hated it, alone, and no house's hatred ever once reached the next. There is no fold here. There is no fold in these people. You cannot break a town that is only a great many people each quietly deciding, alone, to set the table again tomorrow, because you would have to break all of them at once, and they are never, at any moment, one thing you could break at once. I could write instead that Winnow is folded. The form has a field for it and no field for the truth, and if I wrote the lie the record would carry it and no one above me would ever know. I will not write the lie. I will not, because the lie is the thing the whole method runs on now, 100,000 years of records that say the fold worked, kept true only because no one has yet refused to write it when it did not, and I have sat at a human table for a season and been fed from a ration I myself cut, by a man who knew exactly what I was and set my place anyway, and I find I would rather lose my post than let the last true record of this town be the one that says it broke. It did not break. It cannot break. I do not know what the accord will do when it can no longer pretend these people fold. I know only that I will not be the one who helped it pretend. She signed it. She read it to Eli Harrow, across the table, because he had a right to hear the true thing written about his town. And Eli listened, and when she was done he was quiet for a while, and then he did the last thing, the thing she carried the rest of her life, which was to get up, and take her plate, the one he had set every night, and wash it, and set it back in the rack with the family's own, as if she were not leaving in the morning, as if she were simply one of the household whose plate went back in the rack at the end of a meal. "You'll not fold us," he said. "And they'll send someone who's willing to write the lie, and maybe someone after that who's willing to do worse than write it, because you've told them the polite way doesn't work and sooner or later they'll stop being polite. I know that. You know that. You didn't fix anything, sitting at my table and telling the truth on your way out the door." He set the plate in the rack. "But you set it down. The lie. You had it in your hand and you set it down. That's not nothing, whatever it costs you. Out here that's most of what we've got, people who had the lie in their hand and set it down. Sit where the plate is. One more morning. Then go tell them the truth and let them do what they'll do. I told you this was decided at a kitchen table, and it was, and now that you have sat at it, let me tell you the small hard thing underneath, because it is not a comfortable one. Belen Ostry did not save Winnow. I want to be honest about that, because the story would like to end warm and it does not get to. She resigned, and she filed her confession, and the confession went up the chain the way those things went, and joined the others, a reckoner's empty box, a marshal's blank line, a scholar's sealed monograph, a tactician's hazard note, a senate's transcript, a sounder's testimony, and now an administrator's resignation, and like the others it was true, and like the others it was set aside, and Winnow was assigned to a new administrator, who was willing to write the lie, or the one after that. Who was willing to do worse than write it. Eli Harrow was right. Telling the truth on her way out the door did not fix anything. The polite method had failed, and Belen Ostry had reported that it failed, and all her honesty did, in the end, was confirm for the accord the thing that a whole file of honest people were confirming from every corner of the frontier, that these people could not be folded, and that therefore, someday, a frightened and reasonable galaxy was going to stop trying to fold them and start trying to do the other thing. But Eli Harrow was right about the other thing too, and it is the only warmth this story gets to keep. Belen Ostry had the lie in her hand, and she set it down. She was one of the decent ones, and being decent had made her, for a dozen towns, a better instrument of a quiet cruelty, trusted, billeted, fed, folding towns without ever having to feel like the villain of them. And at the 13th she sat at a family's table and was fed from the hunger she had made, by a man who set her place because that was how his house worked, and something in her that a dozen clean folds had never reached came apart at that table, and she set the lie down. It cost her everything the accord had ever given her. It did not save Winnow. It was still, in the accounting Eli Harrow kept and the accord never would, the thing that mattered, that a woman whose whole civilization was built on a comfortable lie sat at a human table until she could not tell it any more, and got up, and went to tell the truth, and let them do what they would do. The town could not be folded. Each family in it went on, alone, at its own table, setting its own place, raising the next set of children who would set the next table, 10,000 separate wills that never once broke at the same time, which was the whole reason Winnow could not be folded, and the whole reason 100,000 years of certainty was quietly ending in grey kitchens no history would ever name. Belen Ostry went to tell the Accord the truth. The Accord set the truth aside, with all the other true things, in the growing file no one had yet read whole. And somewhere on a grey street on a grey world, a widower washed a plate he had set for the woman sent to fold his town, and put it back in the rack with his family's own, and set the table again the next morning, the way his house set the table, the way it always had, the way that could not, by any lever the Accord owned, be made to stop.